however, its pioneers took home an image and Fujitsu were in full production because a PhD student had gone back and managed to find colour solutions for plasma display and make it into a commercial proposition. But the thing had been left lying fallow for the best part of 15 years before that began to happen. Now, I think that's a good example of why going back to older technologies, residual media, is a really important step for us to take. Now, those of us who grew up in Marxism, or indeed in many other Western and Islamic traditions stretching back to Ibn Khaldun, we know to expect at the high point of the civilization the seeds of its decay and its replacement by another. The job at hand is to investigate which emergent principle or principles stand opposed to the hegemony of the grid and its spatialization of everything. This is the actual state of affairs, where by actual we should understand the result of all previous actions. The action is actual is the production of action. What we're looking for is the virtue of that action, what the actual contains as a series of further possibilities that are not fully expressed in its own actuality. And remember, of course, the present is the only time at which an action can take place. Nothing happens in the past anymore, and nothing has yet happened in the future. So today, now, is the only time in which actions are feasible. This is the virtual, right here. Too technical. Posing as coherent and unified wholes, digital media persuade us not only that the present extends indefinitely, but that no action is possible in the wholly actualized digital domain. As Benjamin might have said, the vector smashes this glass prison open with the force of its algorithms. The planned, regimented extension of the actual into indefinite sameness, dreamed of by Stalinists and corporate risk managers alike, crumbles on its own internal dialectic. This is a strategic, satirical strategy of Benjamin Edwards' digital painting. Here's one example. I've put two links to these, which I won't show now, but they'll be on the PDF, which will either be on the ICA site or they'll be on my slideshow. Now, he was roundly attacked recently by Whitney Davis in the pages of October. Edwards works by gathering images and logos from the streets of the USA, especially Washington, D.C., rendering them into 2D and 3D objects for manipulation and composition, and then in many instances reproducing the results as acrylic and mixed media paintings. There's one for Paul Thomas there. There's something still to do with painting, Paul. For Davis, the satire falls flat. The wit of the digital, he ironises, a digital analogy to the digital. Davis recognises in passing, Edwards' point seems to be that the digitally constructed worlds of office fronts and shopping malls, nothing does exist between the digital units. But sadly, he misses the point. Edwards is entirely impressive in his analysis of the artifice of coherence, and in the shockwave sequence documenting the construction of the 2008 painting Triumph of Democracy, painted in response to the financial crisis, the ghostly incompleteness of a planned landscape could not be clearer. If there is a criticism to make, it is that the work deploys vector graphics only to caricature the depthless spatiality of bitmaps. That leaves unaddressed the affordances of the vector to produce difference, the mathematics of emergence. The vector is not an exclusively digital mode. They're traceable in Hogarth's line of beauty, in Clay's admonition to take a line for a walk, and in one of the most emotionally and intellectually satisfying works to date, Chris Landreth's film Ryan. There's a playful, imaginative, ever-evolving animations of its subject, Ryan Larkin, are entirely explicit in the way that the vector graphics are generated by his sort of filmic and animated biographer Landreth. So a link to the NFB site is played out there. What appears in all these examples, as in the pioneer animations of Emile Cole, and in popular culture in some of the best work, I think, of Pixar, is the room they create for futures of which we can only say that they are not the same as the present. On those rare occasions when it's still possible to act outside of the planned accommodations of biopolitics, which of course already has in place strategies to manage the 1% who insist on walking up the down escalator. We make actual the virtual. The potential stored in the existing state of affairs. That is the aesthetics of the vector, openness to unregulated and indeed risky futures. Where time to live is measured in the dull ticking down of a square wave clock function in packet switching, the vector veers out of the plane of the grid in something like an angle I for the mathematicians in the room. The most modest inquiry into the living conditions of the vast majority of the world's inhabitants will demonstrate that the existing regime has failed and fails hourly to ameliorate poverty, hunger, pestilence, and the destruction of human and non-human environments. The wealth it produces is sham celebrity in cheap tin trays. The power it exercises is pure anxiety, risk-averse to the point of inactivity, or it is purely destructive of forces that do try to change conditions. This is the second great facet of the ephemerality of digital media. They occupy a moment not only of apolitical stasis, apolitical in the sense that politics should be about power, but our masters do not wish anything to change. So apolitical status. But it's also about the inevitable fading away of the old, the inevitable instability, the inevitable moment when we will have no choice but to act. The existing time to live of digital media mediation is actually a Heideggerian being towards death. The vector politics of the new media is about becoming, about living the present as action in order to create the future as new. A search for vector art will get you little more than clip art and tutorials, most of numbing, generic, unambitious commercial ordinariness. Many animators I know also disagree with my assessment of Pixar and find their work in 3D vector animation in general dull. Of the great icons of vector mathematics, I see and X are thoroughly bored with the Mandelbrot set. In fact, it's worse than that. The central tool for controlling the steps between keyframes in MPEG and indeed almost every other codec is vector prediction. Born free, the vector is already in chains. I make a plea here, rather than a prophecy, and mark out a job of work. The vector aesthetic does not belong to the grid. It orients towards unforeseeable futures. It is the descriptor of action, of becoming virtual and making new actions possible, new actualities from which further and further changes can emerge. I suppose I'm trying to describe the mathematics and the engineering principles of hope. This is what the vector is for, creating the time to live. Norera, tenakoto, tenatato kato. We have some time for questions. Yeah. Idle gossip. Yes.
Does anybody?
Yes. Does anybody want to ask a question? Why? Okay. No.
The problem with the vector was that it didn't generate tonal qualities.
Didn't generate?
Tonal qualities. You couldn't do toned surfaces. What was the procedure that got to this? Because you're suggesting that this is a vector generated.
Yeah. I think what Landreth is doing here is using, if I understand correctly, and as you know, my technical knowledge begins to fade out at rather indistinct borders. But I believe what he was using vector space to produce trajectories through, and I can't remember what colour space he was using. Probably LAB. So he's using a three-dimensional space, and he's producing a vector by putting two forces pulling on a trajectory through space, and that gives you a gradient. As I understand it, that's how he was working. I don't, for a moment, think that we are anywhere close to this. Because the problem, as R.V. Ray Smith pointed out, is that these geometric, as he calls them, geometric images have to be displayed on arithmetic screens. So one of the great challenges is to find the vector-based screen that would do this kind of work. But most vector screens haven't been developed for colour. And there are also things about how do you do vector-based photography. That's to say, how would you do true 3D photography and get that manageable inside a computer? Well, actually, where the hardware is designed not to deal in general with vectors, but to produce a bit translation. So it's a very, very ambitious project.
I mean, the hardware has to store a display.
Yeah.
So it has to store some set of instructions that allow it to actually get that data up onto the phosphor.
Yeah.
Presumably, there'd be ways of, I mean, what comes to my mind is that one could actually make localized rasters by generating lots of, I mean, essentially the TV display is a very sophisticated vector display, that's all it is. But it's just that we've gone to the point where we have to fix it in memory because we need to actually get it out here next time and the next time and the next time.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's an interesting proposition to vectorise the whole process.
For the moment, I'm going to use it as a metaphor, I think, but I'm hoping one of these days. Cinzia, I think you had any questions? 2 rows behind you.
Yeah, it might pull you in a direction you don't want to go, but you said that aesthetics is not the icing on the cake, but the kitchen where the cake gets made, which is, you're going to be quoted a lot, I think, on that. I'm assuming that by aesthetics you mean the aesthetics of mediation, if I understood right. And I'm assuming that you mean aesthetics as a science of perception, so in its wider sense. And I was wondering if you can talk more about that.
Yeah, I put a couple of notes in here to myself. One was to say, this isn't really, I'm trying, like most of us do, to avoid a technological determination. And I think there are 2 reasons for this. First is that this is not a determinist concept. What I'm trying to do, drawing on the philosophers that some of you will already, I'm sure, recognise from the terminology I was using, the idea that it's not about a causal structure. The causal structure is that kind of step-by-step linear causality employed in simulations, in geographic information systems, for example. So I don't mean determinist. I don't believe I'm being determinist because I'm not talking about futures that can be determined. Quite the contrary, it is about the indeterminate. The second is the term technology, and I've used that here kind of in I hope, an understandable way, but what I intend by that is the concatenation of human beings, devices, and the laws of nature, for that matter, which operate together to make an assemblage, a technical activity. So I don't think it's a technological determinism, but I do believe that unless we pay really